Hi, Franklin.
Hi.
Hi, Chesley. David, nice to see you again or hear you. Have you with us? Rika.
Hello.
Hi, Chesley. Jenna, you look like maybe you're not in clinic right now. That's great. I feel like so many
Yeah.
are like often all in your scrubs, like finding a place in the OR to like listen. So it's great that you have
Hello,
some, you can join us when you're not doing that.
hello
Yeah, joining
everybody.
from home.
Hi, Aqua. Nice to see your face.
Hi.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I think we'll hop in. I think we have a great hour ahead of us. What we're going to do is I have one question about study design that I thought would be a nice teaser for us to kind of think about that Franklin posted. And then we'll just jump into the ethics. So we'll have, if you, in the process, if you can join Menti, I think Joyce is going to be putting the Menti information in the chat. We'll have a few questions about ethics, and then we'll review the homework with our guest lecturer today, Dr. Katie Porter. So to get us started, here's a question that Franklin posted. So he wants to compare two groups of patients, one using a nasal retainer for 6 months after primary cleft lip, and the other that does not use a nasal retainer. And he wants to figure out which group has better outcomes in terms of maintaining nasal anatomy. What do you think? So would a cohort study be the best option? So just like when I get these sort of questions, you first think about, okay, who's the patient population? Let's do a PICO really quick. So who are the patients that want to be studied? Franklin, you can listen. And then if you need to chime in, we'll ask you to.
The patients are a patient who was operated for cleft lip and palate repair.
Okay, yep. Yeah, so our patient populations are individuals who undergoing primary cleft lip palate repair, right? And we have an exposure and we have a comparison. And so you could say that, what would be the exposure? Anybody else want to say what they think an exposure and comparison would be? I know you're all thinking it. You're just not saying it. Okay, I'll jump in. I'll say that you could say the exposed group are those who are getting the nasal retainer. And those who we're comparing them to are those who did not have a nasal retainer. And then our outcome, like this is a beautifully crafted question because it's really clear, like the outcome is maintaining nasal anatomy at 6 months. So there's a time frame to this as well. So in this 2-sentence summary, there's a nice PICO framework that we can work around. Now the question is should this be a cohort study? And so you think about like, as you think about where the state of knowledge is. So you want to have a really robust state of knowledge before you actually try to randomize people. You want to assess the feasibility, and maybe you want to get some preliminary data before you actually jump into an RCT, right? You also want to make sure you've got the right outcome. So I think that the direction of a cohort study is a good thought. So you could do a cross-sectional study, but that doesn't actually make sense because the intervention or the thing that's happening precedes the outcome, right? So we have a very clear time frame here. We have that there is a retainer that's placed and there's a duration of that for 6 months. So now we're kind of like, okay, and you want a comparison group. So it's not a case series. We can eliminate that. We can eliminate a cross-sectional study because we have a time sequence that's really clear. So like, okay, you could do a case control study. With that, though, it doesn't make a lot of sense because you probably have equal number or similar number of patients who have your outcome is not. And you're following patients over time in clinic. So I think a cohort study would be the right choice. And the question then becomes, what do you think about a retrospective versus a prospective cohort study? So if you did a retrospective study, you would have to rely on all the data that exist about compliance, right? About if there's visits that are required, if how regularly those visit, there's adjustments that, I don't know much about nasal retainers, but if there are adjustments that need to be occur. And if those things are happening at different times, they're not recorded, it would be, I think, fairly difficult to really determine without having this additional information, what the relationship is, the effectiveness is of a nasal retainer, how often it was used for how many hours. You know, you can think of all sorts of reasons. You might need some really good data to study this. So so this would be an ongoing conversation, right? And this would kind of be the way that I would think about it. But it's not, I don't think it would be the final word. I think that, you know, Franklin and I would then have a number of conversations about, like, what do you think about doing a prospective cohort study? What do you think the difference would be? Like, and kind of start to think about, does that seem like the most reasonable approach? But I think, Franklin, you're on the right track in terms of thinking about a cohort. And I think because of the amount of information that it would be and the detail of information, I would probably not recommend a first step as being a retrospective cohort, unless you could convince me that you had really good existing data in the chart that could be very useful and help address the question. So I thought that might be a nice way to, and if other people have these kinds of questions about study design, it's really fun to just walk through it and think through it together and hear how somebody gets to this place. So please continue to post kinds of questions. Are there any questions about that? Yeah, Johanna.
Perhaps I just want to chip in and say, at this point, we know, like you highlighted, perhaps a comparative study cohort or
Yeah.
RCT is definitely the direction to go. One key step that I would think of now is feasibility.
Yes.
How much time and money do you have to do your study?
Yep.
Because if you're measuring for 6 months, that requires 6 months of follow-up. And then also at what point, if you're measuring the nasal anatomy, usually at 3 years of age, or are you doing it when the child is a teenager? So all those will impact how feasible a prospective cohort, or a randomized control trial, or even a retrospective cohort is. So at this point, it's also good to start thinking about your kind of budget.
Yes.
That will also direct what kind of a study you can perform here.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, it maybe even decides for you.
Yeah, that's a fabulous point, and that's absolutely true. So, you know, when you think about that, how many study visits would you need? What kind, you know, and because every study visit where if you have somebody come in, if you're measuring things, or if you're even a visit could be a survey that you're administering by phone, that takes a lot of resources. So, you know, and is 6 months the actual, like to Johanna's point, is 6 months a reasonable period of time to allow the outcome to occur? Is that optimal? And then if you're following different people at different 6-month intervals, a study like this can actually take a number of years. Like you could spend 5 years doing this study. So then it also depends from a feasibility standpoint, how many people you have in your clinic that actually you could put into these two groups. So there's cost and feasibility. The two things always I say when it comes to a grant review, there's two things. First of all is, should you do it? Is it an important question? Does it matter? And then the second thing is, can you do it? Do I actually believe that you can do the work that you're proposing? And that gets back to feasibility and some of the points that Johanna was making. The other place I would start to make inquiries about is, how exactly are you going to measure nasal anatomy? And is there a component of this that is relevant to the patient? Because I think sometimes you get really focused clinically on how much things have moved, but that might not matter actually to a patient, to a family. And so don't spend your time doing that if it's not important to the people who it actually affects. You might be better off spending your time doing another question. So this is, so that's just kind of another piece of information as a next step to think about. It's really fun. This is the fun part to me of science, is coming up with the ideas to, like, it's so custom and it's so specific to your question. And then the other thing too is sort of translating this, like I mentioned a little bit with the outcome, as to what actually is your statistically testable hypothesis. So this is an excellent overall general arching question. How would you test it statistically? All right.
Chrissy, I have a last question. How you do decide to do the criteria to separate the two groups, or how do you decide to one people use the nasal retainer and the other people doesn't? What
Yeah,
is
so if you are doing a cohort study, you are simply observing the choices that some clinical person has made or the parents about this treatment.
Mhm.
If you're doing a randomized clinical trial, you're randomly assigning them. Now, there's assignment that occurs, right? When a clinical person gives somebody one treatment versus another, it's not random, and it's in the context of clinical care. And so that's sort of what, and there's reasons for that. There's probably reasons that you would choose somebody to have a nasal retainer and nasal not. And those reasons are really important if you're doing an observational study to understand what those are, because they can explain differences later on.
Mhm.
So if you don't want to assign, you generally in this kind of a study, you would not you personally would not say, well, you should get this and you should get that. If you're doing assignment as an investigator, you should be randomizing them unless there's a good reason that you should not be. And so most of the time it's either, and randomization is really, you have to get that buy-in from the people who would actually be assigning that. And there has to be equipoise, like you truly don't know which one's better. So a cohort study, I think, is a really good first step. It's not a first step because it takes a lot of time and money to collect the data, but it's a place, it's probably where a lot of our craniofacial research starts, is not with randomized clinical trial. Yeah. All right. So with that, I am going to hope if you can all jump onto Menti. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to pivot. And in the meantime, Katie, would you like to introduce yourself? You'll do a much better job than I will.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's my morning. I know it's not for all of you, but it's bright and early. Well, it's still dark and early in the morning here in Seattle. I'm Katie Porter. I am a research scientist at Seattle Children's at the Truman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics and Palliative Care. I've been here for about 10 years, and prior to that, I have a background in public health and in law. My favorite part of my work is that I'm the director of the Research Ethics Consultation Service that serves the University of Washington, Seattle Children's, and Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center. And in that line of work, basically, I'm available to investigators at those institutions and actually even beyond those institutions when they have a question about ethics in their research. And so we have a team of consultants that works together to help researchers navigate any ethical questions that come up in their work. And we're separate from the IRB, which is regulatory oversight. We're just an advisory group, but really with a background and specialty in ethics. So we're thinking, thinking through all of the questions really with ethics in mind, and also knowing the regulations rather than the other way around. So one of the reasons I love this class is that I'm exposed to researchers in very different places from my local region. And I love having the conversations about the things that are coming up in your work and the questions you have. So really looking forward to spending time together this morning or today.
Thank you, Katie. All right, so I think we'll just hop into a few questions that are ethics related in Menti. So here's the first one. What do you all think about when you hear research oversight? What are the words that come to mind for you? Remember, this is anonymous, so nobody knows what you're saying. So you can say whatever you like.
Be honest.
And if you have trouble getting into Menti, please let us know.
Christy,
Yeah.
I think the Menti's not yet allowing us to put in our responses yet.
Sorry about that. Let's say that again.
The Menti is not yet allowing us to put in our responses yet.
It's not
It
allowed.
says presentation in progress, but it doesn't allow us to put in any answers as of the moment.
Okay, that might be a technical issue on my part. Let me see here. Thank you for pointing that out.
Sure.
Christy, it's still showing on the first screen that says research ethics. Hold
We're
on one second.
been having some internet connectivity issues this morning. So, I don't know if that's part of the challenge here. Let me. All right. Well, why don't we, well, let me just see here if I can try this one more time. I'll just relog into Menti and see if we get a better. My screen looked a little strange, so.
But now you have lots of time to think about the words that come to mind when you hear research oversight.
So strange. Why don't we put those in the chat while we're working here? Because I don't want our technical difficulties to delay us so long. Yeah, so one message, excellent, thank you. Quality assurance, okay, yep. So then.
Yeah. Ensuring adherence to ethical protocols, research integrity. Great. Safeguarding research participants, protecting rights of patients, the benchmarks, yeah. Managing conflicts of interest. Policing how protocols are done. Yeah, I like that choice of word. Or I appreciate your honesty in the choice of word.
I'll say I get a little bit nervous because I think of oversight as like people, like, did I misstep? Did I do something wrong?
Yeah.
Can make you feel that way.
Getting in trouble, like the risk of getting in trouble. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if this works now.
We'll try a second question.
My screen.
I just refreshed and it's still showing that title slide.
Okay.
Is that what other people are seeing?
All right. Well, let's just skip Menti today. We don't have that
We're
many.
gonna, we're gonna give Menti a break.
A breather. All right. Okay. So the next question is, have you ever submitted a project to the IRB?
Yeah, you can raise your hand or put something in the chat.
Yeah, Mubarak, excellent.
You see Mubarak's
Marcella,
hand.
no, yep.
Yes,
Aqua, no, okay. Johanna, yes, excellent. Linus has, okay, yep, and Kariga has.
looks
So,
like more
they-
yeses than nos.
Yeah. Eric, I like your little faces. Those are really cute. Okay, and then the last question is, and I think we're gonna try and spend, after we go over the homework, some time talking about this. And so maybe this is something you can all think about. What words describe your experience, thoughts, or concerns about the IRB?
Yes, the IRB is the independent review
Leslie!
board that approves research at your institution.
It's yeah, that Jessie, I'm so sorry that you asked that. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think it's like one of those things that we all take for granted when we're deep in things, are our abbreviations. So, yeah, it is our ethics review boards, essentially. They're reviewing what we're proposing to do to make sure it meets ethical standards. Katie, is that right? Is that a good, okay.
Yeah, that it meets the regulations in your country and location, and that, yeah, it's an ethical committee that is giving you the go-ahead to do your research. So it's you have to get, not for every type of research, but for the types of research it sounds like you were talking about earlier in your discussion, the governing body that gives you permission to go ahead with your research. So who you would submit your protocol to and your consent forms and stuff like that. Yeah, research. Oh, you call it a research ethics committee. Okay. Yes, different names for sure. So sorry about that confusion.
Yeah, and for those of you, I know some of you are not at academic institutions, and so in most cases, academic institutions will have internal review boards, or ethics review committees. If you're at a hospital or a location that does not have one, then you're kind of in a unique position. And I've always encouraged people to identify collaborators at academic institutions that have infrastructure to support it, because you still have to have the ethical review before you do your work. So yeah, if you're in that kind of position, then it's you can get kind of creative about how you get that ethical review. Yeah. Yeah, and Jocelyn, sometimes there are multiple review. What you're pointing out is sometimes there are multiple committees that have to review your IRB. So like in the United States, we have many of us have funding from the National Institutes of Health. And if you're doing a study in the US that has multiple hospitals, they dictate now that you have to have one IRB. But in the case of if you're doing an international study, they really want the ethics perspective that is both local, like to I would submit to Seattle Children's IRB. And then if I was working in Ghana, which I have, we also submit to the Ghana IRB, because the ethical perspective might be very different in Ghana as it is compared to the United States. And so there are cases, or if you're recruiting through schools, maybe you need to go to, a different, you have your institutional review board, but maybe it requires a government review. So it's always good to check with people. And that's why like these consultation services are so helpful. And one of the things that I often recommend is you have a good idea, you have an application, if you can get a consultation with somebody who sits on the IRB, it can be very efficient. You can avoid a lot of missteps. And I think so anyway, just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, the words I've seen are meticulous, strict, thorough. So I sense a theme, difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. Checklist and expensive.
Yeah. All right. Well, you can continue to think. It's true that sometimes now they do charge for their reviews.
Necessary evil, manipulative.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one time consuming, yes. The one thing I'm noticing about the words is that none of them are terribly positive. And that's not surprising. I think a lot of people pretty universally find the process a bit challenging. So, oh, that's funny. Zoom just asked me if I was speaking Spanish, which I'm not. Hopefully, it wants to know if I want to change my language for translation because it thinks I'm speaking Spanish. I didn't mean to. It's a process.
Yeah, also, our internet today, for some reason, I'm in the office and our internet in the office isn't good. So I don't know quite what's going on, but bear with us.
One of those days in the Seattle area. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will also add that I do sit as a member on the Seattle Children's IRB. Obviously, the different oversight committees are very different. But I'm happy to chat about, and we will save time at the end to talk about the kind of submission and approval process and IRB questions or whatever your review committee is called. And I have had a slight change of opinion now since before I was part of that group and after. So I'm happy to share some insight having seen behind the curtain when we get to that part.
All right. So I think maybe now let's pivot to the homework and talk about the case study. I'm going to pop the case study into the chat just to refresh people's memory. See here. Okay. Oh, it's max. I'm maxing out the number of characters it'll let me put in the chat. So I'll do this in groups. Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna open it as well, but yeah, I think I'd love to hear any general thoughts or questions you had about the case, but then also I know there were this was the assignment as well to kind of reflect on this case when you're thinking about the benchmark. So maybe I can, does anyone have questions they want to ask? I'll pause for that first. Seems like not, but feel free to jump in or put something in the chat. So let's just kind of think about that first question to get us started. Which of those 8 benchmarks that you learned about came to play in this case?
And I just posted the 8 benchmarks, so
Thank
you can
you.
have them at easy reference and you're not like, what are those things again? I
Perfect.
know that you
Thank
covered
you.
them in the lecture, Katie. Are there some that particularly stick out for you guys as you think about this case? You can even just put the number, a collaborative partnership. Yeah.
Yeah.
1, 4, and 8. Yep. Fair subject selection and respect for participants and communities.
Yeah, I think those are some big ones in this case. Does anyone want to say a little bit more about why, whether you are the one who put this in the chat or not? Does anyone want to share a little bit about how you think that benchmark comes up? I see a hand.
Yeah, Jessley.
Hey, that's me. Yeah. I answered the collaborative partnership. I'm thinking it's because like most times when it comes to clinical research, we often involve patients as participants, especially in this case that we're discussing. The main data that we're getting from the research actually comes from the participants because they are sharing what their hesitancies are towards receiving vaccination and all that. So I think especially in this kind of research, the collaborative aspect between researcher and participant is very strong. So for this particular research, especially, I think collaborative partnership fits quite well.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's interesting in this case because the collaborative partnership has happened, as you mentioned, as part of the data collection before doing this study or understanding, getting to the point of this study. But I also think it is a potential answer for some of the questions we might have. As I'm going to guess most people read the case and still have a couple questions that come out that we don't have the answer to. And I think that the collaborative partnership is also a way to kind of answer some of those questions and decide next steps. Let's see, I'm seeing 2 come up quite a bit. Social value. Does anybody want to share kind of what they think the social value is or why they think this study has or doesn't have social value? I shouldn't assume.
Yeah, Eric.
Hi. So definitely, I guess because it's talking about something that is very needed in that society or in that study population, which is vaccination. Definitely, the study in mind has a great social value or an impact in the society or in the population that is being studied. But I think I'm sorry, but I might already jump into the second one.
Go
That also predisposes the protocol to a conflict with that benchmark, because in as much as we would want all the members of the population group to be vaccinated against that disease, the idea behind the protocol suggested seems like it would allow, or I might understand the protocol wrong, but would it allow some people to not be vaccinated? Plus, on the top of that, the idea that some people will be rewarded for it in a not equitable manner. So I think that puts the conflicts in some of the benchmarks of the study.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can kind of jump into that question. We can always come back and talk about the benchmarks individually. But you raise a really interesting point about the payment. So first, to answer your question, I think the fact that it's research kind of by its nature means that it's voluntary. You can say no. So I guess you can say no to the vaccine and no to whatever money you would get. That's completely an option. But I think the idea with the money obviously is to try to incentivize people to get the vaccines by adding something else to them. And so you raise a really interesting point about that, the inequity in those different levels of payment. Do you or did anyone else have concerns about that? And what do you think the problem with that might be? Or what do you think that might lead to, what might that cause to happen? How might that impact the study itself?
Katie, are you meaning the different payment or
Yeah,
payment?
the different payments. Thank you for
Different payment.
clarifying. How might the different payments kind of impact your population or the study?
I just come in.
Yeah.
So I was reading through the study and how they worked out the protocol, because it was based on, obviously they did a community forums discussion, and from that community forum discussion, the cost of having this vaccine didn't really come out as one potential issue. So I couldn't understand their angle, asking or giving people money to incentivize the vaccine uptake. And also there's a flip side to it. By giving people money to have a vaccine, you're adding an extra incentive. And it goes to the broader protocol of the study. If their aim is to see whether perhaps introducing payments for everyone in the future to get that vaccine is something that would work, perhaps that could be allowed. However, if I was a reviewing ethics officer, and that's not part of their aim of their study, to see if in the future they will introduce, say, a $20 payment for everyone who gets the vaccine, what will happen is people get the vaccine when you give them the money, but after the research stops, people won't get the vaccine. So there is no social value in such a research. Yeah. So it has to be answered by the research team as well.
Yes, I 100% agree with you. And that's something that's not clear. And you bring it up in two very interesting ways. So first, why did they decide to introduce money as a payment for vaccines? Because we don't have any evidence that that came up in the conversations. Like, well, if you paid me, maybe I'd do it. If we're hearing that in the community, then maybe that's a reason to think, okay, well, let's consider paying people because we really want them to get vaccinated. But we don't really know where that idea came from. And I agree that's always kind of given me a little bit of pause, like why did they decide to do that? And then more importantly, yes, I 100% agree that in order to have social value, and this actually hits on a lot of the benchmarks, it's social value, it's risk benefit, it's participant selection, that if we don't have a plan, an actual feasible plan to use the data that we use, what we learn from this study in the future, then why did we do the study? Which I think is what you were saying. So if we don't have a plan and don't have the infrastructure or the finances in the community to continue, if this works, to actually implement that on a larger scale, then I don't know what the value of knowing this answer is. And that's another thing we don't know, but I would say in order for me to approve this study, I would need to know that there is a plan that if the answer is yes, people really respond to this, it's a great way to get people vaccinated, I would want to know that there's a plan in place to actually implement this community-wide. Otherwise, what's the point?
Jasley, you have a question or a comment or a thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the incentivizing with monetary rewards, I guess you can say. Again, this might be something that's different regionally, but in my institute, or maybe in Malaysia in general, I'm not too sure. But we often give participants a small like monetary token, I guess you can say, as a thank you for participating in our research. It's not always only towards one group. Sometimes if we have multiple groups, we give just a monetary incentive to everyone. Sometimes not monetary, sometimes it's like an in-kind. So like sometimes we give them like free toothbrushes, toothpaste samples, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And of course, these were ethically approved because the research was conducted. But I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on incentivizing participants to join a research project? Because obviously we give them the freedom to participate if they choose to or not. But would giving them some kind of reward kind of sway their decision making in a way that may not be ethically sound?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think of this, what this study is doing is different than what you were talking about with the in-kind or monetary kind of incentive that my institution and my research often does as well, which is, you know, if you do this survey or if you join the study and do each step, we will give you $20 or whatever it is. Obviously, the more involved it is, the higher that number is oftentimes. That's different to me because that's everybody who participates gets this I'd like to think of it as a thank you. Like, thank you for your time. Thank you for your samples. Thank you for whatever you did. Thank you for your information, your data, your willingness to help science. And here is something for you. Money, a toothbrush, whatever. This is different in that the money is really part of the intervention, which that's not how I think of a thank you incentive. So in that respect, I do think this study is very unique. Paying, you know, at least in the United States, there is some history, it's not unacceptable to incentivize people to make good health decisions. So oftentimes a workplace might say, we're going to give you a free gym membership and you can go exercise. And we want you to do that. So we're going to give you this thing of monetary value to try to get you to do that, or money to stop smoking, or like those are things that have been used in the past. So the idea of paying, and this goes to Chehenna's comment before, it would be acceptable, I think, for the community to decide this is important enough that we want to pay people to try to get them to do it. So if the answer was yes, this works, I would be okay with the community implementing a plan like this. It's still not forced, but it's maybe might help people who are still deciding, like, oh, I can't decide. I'll just tip them a little bit more over to say yes. I think my concern with this is that the different amounts. I understand why you would want to know, like, does everyone who gets 20 do it and everyone who gets 10, in which case we could just give 10. I understand that, but I feel like in the context of research, if you know going into it that people are going to get different amounts of money, and then you get assigned to the $0 group, are you going to actually follow through? I don't know that you're going to get the right answer to the question by doing it this way. And so, or you might get the answer, but you're going to mess up your scientific validity by having people actually just kind of agree to join, and then depending on the money they get, walk away and not follow it through. So one approach I have seen and that I like a lot is that well, this wouldn't necessarily help the question that I just raised, but at least it would help my concerns about equity in general, is that everyone will get $20. It's just when you get it. So you're going to get the $10 see what happens. Do you follow through with the vaccine? Do you not? Does it change your behavior in any way? And then at the end, here's another $10 to get you equal to what everyone else would have gotten. But you do have to kind of understand that by telling people you're going to give different amounts of money, and that's another question, is should you tell people you're going to give different amounts of money, or will that really mess up your science? But if you do, I like the idea at the very end that everyone who participated is equal.
Katie, there's a question in the chat from Linus.
Yeah, so, okay. Can incentive be considered in a situation where participants take time off their gainful employment or activity to participate in the study, more considered as a reimbursement for time spent? So I think of that slightly reimbursement differently as well. That reimbursement is paying you back for something you lost rather than giving you something extra for what you gave me as a researcher. This issue of employment and time away required to participate, I think actually is more of in some ways, a recruitment and participant selection issue. I think by having studies where the only time they can do things is during the time that a lot of people are working, the time that the researchers are working, because they don't want to go after hours. What ends up happening is you limit yourself to people who can take the time away. So if there was an incentive, I mean, I suppose you can think of the incentive as a way to make up for the time you had to take off from work. But I think a better approach is designing a study that doesn't kind of discriminate based on how easily you can take time off of work, how flexible your work schedule is, if you have kids at home and you can't leave them at home, can you bring them to the study? Are you paying for transportation? I think those are questions that I think we're now really recognizing have led to a lack of diversity in our study populations because we haven't accommodated people who have more of a challenge to participate. So I do think that reimbursement or some kind of in-kind support, childcare during the appointment, can really help make our research population more diverse.
And I'll just say, I think, I can envision for parents of children with orofacial clefts who often come from really long distances. If you had to do something in person, you have their transportation and their time away from work. And if that's the only way you're going to get them to come in, I think reimbursing them, you could make the case that it's reasonable to cover those costs, right, Katie?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because they're like Katie says, it's something you're covering something that would have otherwise been lost to them. They would lose something. And when you put our participants in the position of losing something to participate in research,
they're less likely.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all been there, and I think so. Yeah, I think methodologically, like from an epidemiologist perspective, when I look at this case study, one of the things that really bothers me is that they have two different interventions. There's nobody who's not getting an intervention. They're either getting education or a vaccine, right? And so what are you actually comparing?
Yeah.
If you want everybody to you have to have a common platform. So you either give nobody education and you look at vaccine. That often is not very acceptable, I would say, these days, or you give everybody education, and on top of it, one group gets vaccine. So that way you can isolate, this is the effect of the vaccine, not the education. Because how are you going to know?
The money? Do you mean the money?
The money, yeah, the money.
Yeah. It's
So-
education or money, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, education or money. So how do you know what actually works? So, yeah. So that would be like, from a methodologic perspective, I would be like, this, you're not gonna be able to answer. What question are you answering? What's
Yeah.
your PICO framework?
I think that's actually the biggest flaw. I agree with you. That is the biggest flaw of this design as it's presented, is that the science is confused. And that's a really big problem. And I think this is actually one thing I like about this case, and especially given the question you were talking about as a group about the cohort study and the study design for, I think sometimes we think of study design being science and ethics being ethics. And one thing I really like about this framework that I shared with you was that the study design and the science is part of the ethics, because if you're not creating a good solid study that's going to answer clearly answer a question, then all of these other benchmarks kind of start weakening, because you're asking people to participate and you don't even have a good chance of getting the answer in the end. And so what's the point? And totally agree. The fact that the $0 adds something. They have 0, 10, 20, I think, if I remember correctly, for the monetary, but the $0 gets something else, then you're not actually comparing. You don't know what that $0 group would have done if it was just $0. So I think the other thing is, one question I have is, what is this education, and should everybody be getting it? Education if it's just basic education that might be in the informed consent form, then everybody should get it. If it's a bigger education project or intervention, then don't mix it up with money. Just do education and not education. And then maybe educate at the end as a way to kind of help the community itself. But yeah, I think the mixing of two interventions is going to lead to much confusion at the end when you're thinking about the results of this study, and you won't know the answer.
Yeah, one thing I'll add too, I've done it's been a long time, but I for a while I did consulting for clinicians. And one of the things I would often do is help them review their IRB applications. And or I'd come in when somebody had submitted something and they were having a lot of problems with the IRB, and it was a lot of back and forth. And I think that when you don't have a clear question, all that it's going to do is take months for you to get that sorted out. And so that project planner that we have, like in that home button on the Canvas website, that really gets you to think about, what is your question? Because what are you trying to get out of it? And that, just thinking about that and having a really clear vision before you start writing your IRB. A lot of times what I see is people have an idea and they know they need an IRB, so they start writing the IRB. But the IRB is not meant for you to plan your project. It's meant for them to review the ethical perspective of it. And so if you don't have a really clear plan when you write the IRB, it then just starts to kind of devolve. And that's one of the reasons it can be so time consuming, because you start kind of putting people into this. The people who are reviewing it, who are kind of looking at checklists and making sure some general things are met, are confused on what you're doing. Yeah. Okay. Let's see, I don't know if, we have an answer key to the homeworks. I know I want to leave a little bit of time for questions about the IRB or other topics. And so I guess one thought is, I'll post the other questions, and I wonder if people have particularly burning questions that they wanted answered about these.
I would love to pose a question. that I'd love to have a little chat about, which has to do with informed consent. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about what might the impact, how would telling people in the consent process, we're going to, some of you will get $0, some will get 10, some will get 20. Do you think that that will impact people's willingness to participate or drop out or continue? And is not telling them a possibility? How would you feel about not telling people that that some people will get 0, some will get 10, some will get 20? What do you have do you like it? Do you have concerns about that idea? What are you thinking about? Yeah, Eric.
Yeah. With regard to the differences in the amount, I think what also matters, or what I mean, if I wouldn't mind if there would be differences in the amount, as long as the participants are sure to be at the same level at the baseline. I mean, I think it would be very unfair if there'd be impoverished participants who would be tending to receive more as compared to those who are perhaps more wealthy and be categorized to receive lesser. Perhaps if we're going to, if the study would suggest giving different amount of money for that study, perhaps at the very least have the same baseline of economical or practical needs level for those participants, just so that the bias of giving more to those who have less will be addressed.
Yeah, so the point I hear you raising is that there might be your own financial means, how wealthy you are, might impact how that money affects your decision and whether it changes your mind to get vaccinated or not. So knowing kind of some underlying information about people might be important in the science in order to actually see. Yeah. Do you think there is a situation where can you imagine a way the whole point of informed consent is telling people honestly about the study so they can decide whether they want to participate? Can you think of a way that you could potentially still give the information about the study, but not tell them they might be getting different amounts of money? Or do you think that's critical to the decision?
There are studies that do use deception,
Mhm.
and they are ethically reviewed and they can be approved.
Yeah.
I think what I see most is that at the end, they come out with the truth.
Yeah.
So everybody eventually learns what the study was about. So I think, it's similar to one of the challenges that often occurs in randomized clinical trials, which is people sign up because they want the intervention. They think the intervention is better. And so if they don't get what they want, then they drop out because they didn't get the medicine, and it's so critical. If we actually want to answer the question, we can't have those folks drop out. And this seems sort of analogous to me. Like if you're signing up and you know that some people are going to get 20 and you don't get anything, well, then why bother continuing? Right. I could very easily see people kind of being like, well, I didn't win the lottery, so I'm not going to be part of the project. I don't get the $20.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
I got 10 and somebody else got 20. Like,
Yeah,
it
I
just
think
creates a weird dynamic.
the way we solve the example you were giving about when people want the intervention is when possible, we blind them. We tell them up front, you're not going to know which one you get. but you
Right.
might get this and you might get that. And sometimes you can't. There's definitely interventions where you can't hide it. Though I have seen some attempts to blind some pretty major interventions. Not always with success, but so here the difference is you're not telling them up front, you won't know. You probably would say how I would do this and feel comfortable ethically. And this is if we've solved the multiple intervention issue, because I think that's kind of a deal breaker as it stands right now. But I would probably say in the consent form, we're looking to see how vaccination uptake is impacted by various incentives or something like that, and not say numbers. Do you want to be in the study? Here, you get what you get, you go through with it. You don't know that other people got more than you or less than you because you don't know the numbers, you just get what you get. And then at the end, like Christy said, I think it's really important when you aren't fully transparent at the beginning that you say at the end, when they're done, when they get the vaccination or say, no, I'm not going to, at that appointment, let's say, you say, okay, thank you so much, for your participate. Well, that's, I guess, tricky because if they don't get the vaccination, maybe we aren't. But if they come into the vaccination appointment knowing that we're looking to see whether they go in or not, then you could say, you were in a group that received $10, but there was actually a group that received 20. And so here's another 10 to kind of bring you equal. But
Also-
you didn't tell them in advance that some people would get more or less, is probably how I would do it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it becomes really tricky because if I'm thinking about this population, immigrant populations in the United States that are concentrated in one city tend to be very close knit,
Yeah,
know each other. and
that's
people-
true. Absolutely.
And I don't think you would actually be able to pull this off
You
by
might
exception.
you might need 0 breaks in time. So you would bring them in, say, we're doing a study with incentives for, oh my gosh, with incentives for vaccines. We'd like to offer you $10. Will you get the vaccine? And they either say yes or no. And if they say no, you say thank you, goodbye. And if they say yes, you then give them another $10. It's getting complicated. You're right. The more we're thinking about how would we actually do this, and I appreciate your attention to that detail and the practicality, is that it does start getting more complicated when you start thinking, how can we solve all of these issues that we've created? Maybe this isn't a great study.
I think, and I guess, to me, that speaks to feasibility.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah.
is it, should you do it, number one? And would eventually there be a policy where we would be incentivizing people with money to get a vaccine? Would that ever happen? And if not, don't do the work.
Exactly.
Then, like, can you do it? How are you actually going to do this in a way that feels like, it meets these criteria, where you can actually get an answer to your question?
Yeah.
So I think that's where, like, before this gets to an IRB, you want to have a lot of this discussed and thought out and bring in different people with different perspectives to kind of think about it, because otherwise it'll get, I think, mired down in a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. There were a couple of questions, Katie, I'm just going to put that had to do with informed consent that people had in the discussion. So I thought maybe you could touch on those. And I think what's going to happen is we'll end up posting the answers to the ethics homework. And then also, I think Katie has through Friday to answer questions that you might have about the IRB, about ethics in the discussion.
Yes,
So
I will
that we don't
respond.
actually
I will be-
get to Yeah, today Katie
Yep.
will go in and answer you. I know that we thought we'd maybe get to all of them, but. the
Yeah,
time
I
goes-
will keep tabs on the discussion in Canvas and will be responding into your questions as best that I can. Okay, so let's see, this first question. What useful information could the investigators learn? Oh, was
Oh,
that?
yeah,
No,
I'll
that
get
was my question. That was our question. Okay, I got it. In what ways does informed consent for research differ from informed consent for medical treatment? Yeah, this is a great question. There's a lot that's similar in that you're giving information and kind of asking someone to make a decision. But to me, the big difference is research is voluntary. So whereas in medical treatment, sometimes there's something a doctor or practitioner, clinician really thinks is best for you. So it's not here are two things, you make the decision. It's, I really think you should do this. Here's what it would entail. Do you agree to do it? Like, I really think you need this surgery. Here's what it would look like. Do you agree to go under anesthesia? Do you agree to this and that? But with this statement of, I think this is what's best for you. In research, we don't ever say what we think you should do this or should do this other, like should participate, shouldn't. It's really meant to be very voluntary because there isn't necessarily direct benefit to the participant. We're usually answering a question that we don't know the answer to. So we can't really say we think this would be better. There's some exceptions. I'm thinking about work done at Seattle Children's in cancer treatments, where at some point, almost every patient at Seattle Children's who has cancer is in a research study because there is no clinically approved treatment for them anymore. And so the only way to have any chance of survival is to try something experimental. So that's a little different, but in most cases, I mean, and it's still their choice. They're still told, we don't know if this is going to work, but a lot of people, the majority of people still try because it's something, it's a chance. In most research that isn't quite so high stakes, we really want that to be voluntary. So in my mind, that's the biggest difference, is how much kind of influence or persuasion we're giving, because in medical treatment, usually we really think you should do this. This is our standard of care. This is what we tell everybody who's in your situation to do. And that's a really different conversation in research. Okay, when does one obtain informed consent during a randomized clinical trial? Is it after randomization or prior? One needs to take an informed consent for each phase of the study. Yeah, so in a randomized clinical trial, the informed consent is almost always before. I would say always, except that I think there's very, very, very rare exceptions, so I don't want to say always, but it's before randomization, because being randomized is part of the decision they have to make. Are they comfortable being randomized? A lot of people are not. As Christy mentioned, a lot of times people want the intervention and they're hoping for that, or they want their doctor to do what's best for them, which goes back to the prior question. I want someone to think about me as a person individually and tell me what to do. I don't want a random computer to decide which one I get. I want someone who knows me to decide what to do. So we would include the randomization as part of the consent so that they are agreeing to being randomized and getting one or the other, that nobody that knows them is like choosing for them. They're gonna be randomly selected to get one or the other.
I'm gonna just
Yeah.
post this comment. This was from the discussion, and I just wanted to make a comment about this.
Yeah.
So basically, this person said that obtaining consent can be really challenging, and that it's hard to get people in clinic to actually consent to research. And one way that they've tried to overcome this is by having their doctors talk to the patients about the research. And this is an incredibly smart and effective strategy. And so I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of trust that is often built between a healthcare provider, a doctor, a nurse, and the patient. And having research explained to them by then, instead of like a QR code on the internet, or having me as an epidemiologist call them out of the blue, they don't know me, you know, or one of my research staff, that this approach of, you know, having their doctors and or nurses like talk to them about the research is really smart, and it's a good idea. And doctors actually in a lot of cases have a tremendous amount of weight. And so it's really important, if you're the researcher or if you're the PI and you're a physician, that you have your physician colleagues or doctor colleagues on the same page as you about a project, and be willing to talk to their patients about it. It is one of the most effective recruitment tools, and you will have much better retention in your studies.
Yeah.
So that's just, I think it was worth kind of highlighting this experience and saying, I really agree with it.
We often call that a warm handoff rather than kind of a cold approach.
Yeah.
Where the doctor, when seeing a patient, might say, hey, I think you are eligible. There's a research study happening that my colleagues are doing. I think you're eligible. Would you like me to ask one of them to come in and tell you more about the study? It can be as simple as that. They're not really even telling you anything about it. They're not telling you you should or shouldn't join. It's simply them being the one to tell you that a study exists. Often makes people a lot more open to hearing about it, because of the way that information is coming to them. And I will also add that, this is a place where I think there is some kind of ongoing conversation in the ethics community, because the regulations, at least in the US and probably elsewhere, are written, they're very, very strict, often not wanting doctors involved. If you're the clinician to the patient, you can't be the one to consent them. We want you wearing one hat and one hat only, and you can't have different roles, and you can't mix those worlds because of this fear of people not making a voluntary decision. And yet, in the research that I've done and others have done, where we're talking to participants about how to make the research process better, so often we hear, I want to talk to my doctor about it. I want them to tell me about it. I want to hear what they think. So there's a real disconnect right now going on about the regulations being so protective and what participants and people really want to make that decision, and they don't match together. And so there's work being done to try to kind of research being done to show more evidence of what participants want, how people actually want to engage with research and make those decisions to participate. And it's often not in line with the regulations as they currently exist. So
we're at time. I think
are we? Oh, God.
I mean, time just flies. Is Katie will hop on to the discussion and respond to the questions that we did not get to.
Yes,
We'll
I
post
will
the
do that.
answers to the homework. If you have additional questions, I really encourage you to post.
Yes.
And she'll respond to your questions. And so please don't hesitate to do that. Our next module, which is on measurement, and questionnaire design will be coming out today. We have a wonderful epidemiologist and colleague of mine who's originally from Brazil, Joanna Kuhn Cruz, who will be joining us to talk about that topic area. I, like always, will be in class. I did want to make a quick announcement, I think, is that I have to cancel office hours for this Thursday. So just as a reminder, I think we started with having people join up for a session, but then realized that a lot of people already had clinic and other things on their schedule. And so this week we're not having office hours, and the office hours are completely optional. I do really enjoy talking with you, and so hopefully you will join me next Thursday. If you have a study that you want to think about, please let me know. Throw it in in a discussion board, and we can talk about it in class next week, kind of like we did with Franklin's idea. So with that, like Katie and I stay on, and Joyce until 7:30 in case you all have additional questions, but consider class dismissed for the day. It's nice to see you all, and it was a very enjoyable conversation. So Katie, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. And yes, I will be tuning in to the discussion for the rest of the week. So please feel free to continue posting questions, engaging with each other, and I will chime in as well.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Katie and Christy. Thank
Yeah,
you.
bye, Aqua.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you,
Oh, you're welcome,
everyone.
John.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. See you next week.
Bye, Bobby.
Eric, I saw you posted a question. I'm happy to respond to that since you're still here. Are broad consent forms that were signed when they were admitted to the clinic facility acceptable for use in research? That's a really good question. I think it's probably institution specific. You might want to check. I would think that that was a direct message, so other people don't have it. I would think that probably you would need to do something in addition, because research is usually viewed so differently than clinical work. So things that people just have to agree to be part of, get clinical care. I think we're kind of used to, okay, signing things that we're not even reading because we want to see the doctor. And I suspect that for research, they'd want something a little more less hidden or more intentionally focused on research. But that would be a place where I would recommend reaching out to the ethics committee or over whatever the oversight IRB group is for you, just to kind of explain what's happening clinically and see what they would want in addition.
Eric, I think the only case I could ever even see that sort of flying is if it's like giving you permission to use their clinical data that's collected in the routine clinical.
Is that what your question is? Yeah, that's
like
I could see that
especially
possibly.
Sorry, but yeah, I mean, coming from the setting that I'm in, like a school setting, wherein a lot of patients come in for their treatments as well. We usually ask them to sign a broad consent form, for all the procedures that they'd be doing, and in turn, we now have a barrage of information, a barrage of data, which I think are very much usable, very much it's a fertile area for research as well. But I'm just concerned whether these data that they provided, or I mean we were able to obtain because they were patients in our institution, are actually allowable data that we may use for whatever projects we'd have in mind.
Yeah, and that in our setting, that would be something the IRB would approve a waiver of consent for your use of the data. So you could use the data without getting consent from the donors of the data. So it would still go through the IRB, but they might potentially say, yes, we'll grant you this waiver so that you don't have to go back and contact them, and you can use the data But then there probably are rules about de-identifying it and making sure that it's anonymous, but oftentimes that is how that would work. And that happens with clinical samples. Often you can get a waiver of consent in order to test, little bits of biopsies for something, or.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's a lot of times, I think historically we have gone to the IRB once we have a specific question in mind to use data that's already in the chart. I think there is a little bit of a conversation right now about people opting into research when they get clinical care to kind of, try and not circumvent it, but to make it a little more efficient, to use the existing data. I had a thought, now it jumped my brain. I think I know what I was gonna say, is that a lot of times the IRB wants to know, why can't you consent people when you're asking for a waiver of consent? And a lot of times the issue is it's really hard to get a hold of people once they've left clinic. And you would be able to be able to get to hold of them, to explain the research, to get a consent, something that was signed back. It just means that there's a lot of people who wouldn't be in the study because you would only get a hold of a very few number of people. And that can be an equity issue, right? That the people then that you're studying are a very select group of few. So you can kind of make the case that it makes sense to, you can be more inclusive, and the risks are minimal. Typically, when we're just using existing data, we're not, the risks are primarily around inadvertent release of information. They're not more than that. So anyway, that's just something to think about as you frame IRB, the conversation.
Yeah. And in that case, I think one of the strongest arguments is of scientific validity argument, which is saying, in order to answer the question, we need the data from everybody. And if we don't have the data from everybody, if it's only who we can get a hold of, as Christy said, we've got a very small and unique population that we're getting data from, and we're not going to help the larger group because we're missing so much data. And that, to me, as an IRB person, is a very convincing argument when they bring in the science of why we need the data from everybody.
Katie, you
Got it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh no, Eric, go ahead.
No. I mean, that's a very good point. Making sure that trying to angle it in a way that using all these data would make the results, or would make the findings more solid or more sound, rather than trying to gather everyone again and get the consent, which in turn might lessen the population or the sample number later on.
Yeah. You can even tie that into, if it affects your power calculation, if you can't answer the question because you wouldn't have enough people. Everybody froze. Could you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
I was just going to say that, you can also, if you know how many people you need based on a power calculation, that can also be a reason, because if you don't have sufficient power to answer the question, that also can become an ethics issue. Why are you spending the time and the risks to do this work if you can't answer the question? So, you can make the case that you need all of the data in order to be able to be sufficiently powered to answer the question. And that can be an ethics, the people will look at that from that lens.
And the disparities in your study population, who would you most easily reach? People who've never moved, who have very solid, housing, people that are nearby, people that have, I think you tend to get people that are, the people you would get and the people you would not get are different in important ways, and kind of calling out who you think you'd be losing can often be a good part of that argument too.
Katie, I had a question for you. At the very beginning of class, you mentioned that you had a different perspective being when you were on the IRB than you do now. What is that, and how has that changed?
Yeah, my perspective now is just that the people who are making the decision to approve research are just people. We're people who are most often researchers. We care about research because that's why we sit on the IRB. We want research to happen. We want it to be good. And so I used to have a lot of fear in approaching the IRB because I felt like they're kind of out to get me and they're looking at everything and like trying to knock my study down. And that is not the case. We're actually, we want to approve it, but sometimes people just don't let us because they haven't thought through things or they didn't write it clear enough. And so to me, the biggest thing I've learned since being on the IRB is just explain it clearly, explain your decisions. If you like, explain why do I need this? Why do I need this waiver? It's not because it's hard to get a hold of people. That's not gonna fly. It's hard to get a hold of people. No. But if you can explain why the science can't happen, why the research can't happen, the question won't be answered if we don't have all the people. I'm like, okay, that seems like a good reason to grant you this waiver. Or why did you choose to only look at this population? Tell me why you're not including these other people. Give me your reasons. And that's so helpful because we're trying to understand the whole thing. And it's not that we're trying to bat research down. We actually, I think, in general, want to say yes, but people don't, the researchers and their submission don't always let us, is how I think about it now. They didn't give us the right information. They didn't answer these questions. They didn't explain their decision-making. And then we are left with questions and we can't approve it because we don't fully understand.
Yeah, and Katie, maybe you can, I love that comment.
Write something about that.
Write something about that in the
I'll
discussion.
write that up.
I think that is just lovely because I think it's true. And, you know, and maybe I'll chime in and basically just point out that finding a way to work, like, I think it really varies, but if there's someone you can talk to at your IRB when you have questions,
yeah,
you're so much better off. And IRBs really do vary. Some have a very strict wall. And those are the hardest, I think, to work with. But for I think increasingly people are more accessible. And I have been on calls, Eric, just so you know, like there's a question and I'm like, I don't care how it's answered. I just want how should I answer it? You know, it doesn't actually affect my research, but it's a regulatory thing. And if you check the wrong box, you could go down the rabbit hole with the IRB. And so I'll call the IRB and I'll be like, okay, which one of these is better? And they'll walk you through it. They'll be like, well, if you answer it this way, then this is what the consideration is. If you answer that, I'm like, okay, fine, this is what I want to do. Because, you know, as researchers, we wanted to get the research done. And one of the lenses that the IRB is not only the ethics of the project, but there's also a legal framework that they are in charge of. And so some of the questions you're like, I don't understand, you know, and having a consultation can just take you so far. And then, you know, Katie and I worked together during COVID to get a situation where we could drop off everything somebody would need to participate in a study. And then when we picked, they could do all the study activities and sign the consent. And so the only thing, they could sign the consent whenever, but we didn't. So, but the consent came with the packet. And so we were able to actually, you know, one stop instead of going back and forth and having internet and all of this connectivity that would have really affected the ability to collect the data. And if they didn't sign, we checked the consent, it was signed when we picked everything up. Then that was fine. If it wasn't signed, we couldn't pick up stuff, which is fair. They didn't agree to participate, right? So you can, if you have people on your IRB they have office hours, you can ask, do you have office hours? Do I have a question? Because you can save yourself so much time and pain and heartache just by getting some clarity on how you should answer things. And then like you're getting the one-on-one consultation. I feel like the class that happens after class is the class that you want to have
I
happen.
know, like all the good stuff is coming out right now, but
And the
I'll
class
put it
was
in the
great.
discussion,
The
but
class was great, Katie. I think, but you just start coming up with these things,
I
right?
know.
But I think the other thing is like the advice I always have for people is read the question. Because lots of things you want people to know, but the IRB is asking a very specific question of you. And a lot of times it's a yes, no answer. Answer it yes, no. It doesn't mean you're holding anything back because you're going to cover the whole protocol. But if you say yes and blah, 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 it starts to really make things complicated. They're asking for a yes, no question, answer it yes, no. And if there are other things that you feel like are relevant, you put them in, there are places to put that. And the other thing that I always tell people to do is a lot of times you have, it seems like they're asking the same thing and you put it in 3 different places. I put it in one place and I say, see question 1.2. And the thing about that is then
That is so smart.
you only update it in one place. Right. And so if it feels like you're saying the same thing throughout your IRB application, look at the question and see, is that question answered with what I've put in the detail for this other question? And then either answer the question because it's not, or refer them. But I really try and make my IRB application so that information is only in one place, because when you go to update it, which you inevitably want to make changes, and you forget to change it in one place or another, it delays your study.
Yeah,
And so
it does, because we've definitely had studies where we're like, wait, here they say this and here they say this. Which is it? We can't approve it because we don't know.
Yeah.
Like, and that's exactly, yes, that's exactly, Christy. That's great advice. Not many people do this, but it would be very helpful.
I've never had an IRB come back and say, you have to copy that information and put it in this section. I've never had them do that.
Yeah.
So, and I think that, you know, that's why I feel like having a really clear picture of what you want to do before you fill out that form, and people start with the form and it usually doesn't work out well. Oh, anyway, our two,
Yeah, we're
the
just
one-on-one
throwing valuable
lessons
nuggets of
learned
information.
consult
Yeah.
for you, Eric. Christopher, I don't know if you're still there, or if you have to step away, but we're here if you have any questions. I guess we're at 7:35, so.
Oh,
This,
wow.
this is perfect. Thank you.
You're
Thank you.
right.
This is
Thank you so
You're right.
much. Thank you, Christy.
See you next week.
Thanks,
See you.
Christy. Thanks, Katie. I really love this session. Thank you.
All right, bye. Okay,
Good morning to you there. Good night from me here.
Katie, thank you so much for joining us and spending 6
pleasure.
a.m. time with us.
Always.
Really appreciate it.